Hello, everyone. I am very sorry I can't be there in person, but thank you to Ellie for giving me a chance to present some of this material in a remote manner. Most of you, all of you in this room, are familiar with the reasons why we engage in dog population management. Oftentimes it's with the goal of reducing numbers or undesirable behaviors. Sometimes it's to support rabies programs. And oftentimes there's a motivation to reduce suffering or increase well-being of the dogs, even though that's not necessarily as well envisioned or quantified as the previous goals that I mentioned. But what I want to do in this talk is to elaborate a little bit more on that particular element of motivation for dog population management, and more specifically to phrase it in terms of something that I'll call in this talk preventable deaths. First though, in order to get a good grasp of some of the results that I'll present, I think that it might be helpful to very quickly review some simple models and elements of population growth, because it's relevant to the results that I will be discussing in just a moment. If you imagine that we put a few dogs on an island with plenty of food, but no other dogs, and let them do their thing, they will exhibit something that we call exponential growth or potential growth. And that's illustrated by the first equation that you see up there, which is really not too complicated. It just means that the number of dogs we're going to have at some later time t, or xt, is equal to the number that we started out with times the growth rate, raised to the power of how many time intervals have gone by. So to make that simpler, by use of an example, let's just say that dogs have the capacity to increase at about 50% per year. I'm just making that up right now. And let's say we go to that island and start with 10 dogs. After 10 years, if the dogs exhibit exponential growth, or in other words, their full potential growth rate, we will have those 10 original dogs in the equation that you see at the bottom of the top section, times 1.5, which is the 50% growth rate, added to the 1, which represents the dogs that you started out with, so 1.5, times 1.5, 1.5, 10 times to represent the 10 years. And if you do that math, you end up with 577. Now that's potential growth. Obviously in the real world, that essentially never happens. What we get is something like what we see at the bottom of this slide, which is called logistic growth. We're still on the island, we still started with 10 dogs, and the growth rate looks exponential at the beginning. But then it starts to slow down until it approaches this amount that we call the carrying capacity, which is simply the ability of that environment to support dogs, which imposes an upper limit on their numbers. And the equation we don't have to worry about, but I do want to point out specifically the part of the equation that I've got in the circle down at the bottom left. That says K, which is the number that's the carrying capacity, minus the number of dogs, divided by the carrying capacity. Now what that means is that if the number of dogs N gets close to or reaches the carrying capacity K, that quantity becomes 0. The whole equation becomes 0, and it means the population's not growing. And that's what we actually see in the real world most typically. Now the reason I spent a few minutes talking about that is because it has some implications that are relevant to our results. First one is that most dog populations that we work with in dog population management programs are probably existing at or somewhere close to their carrying capacity. That's not necessarily always the case, but it's typically the case. Even when that dog population is at its carrying capacity, however, it's still got the capacity to grow. It's still trying to grow if the carrying capacity would somehow change to let it grow. And the way that it's trying is that more puppies are still being born than are needed to replace the adults that are living in that population currently. And all of those extra puppies if more resources became available, could survive and make the population grow. But under the existing carrying capacity, all of those extra puppies either have to die or they have to leave. That is just how nature typically works. So that's a little bit of background, just a little bit more to talk about what I mean when I mention the term preventable deaths, which is the focus of this talk. Dogs or any set of animals can die a number of different ways. Of course, they can die naturally from old age or disease of some sort or a medical condition of some sort, or they can die in accidents. And neither of those things are being considered preventable deaths in the context of this paper. So let's ignore those. Everything has to die some way, and we're not focusing on that for the time being. On the other hand, dogs can be killed in management programs, in culling programs, or removed to a shelter and euthanized there. Or all of those extra puppies that I just mentioned in the previous slide die because there's not space for them in the population. Those two types of death that are in the red boxes are what I'm considering preventable deaths, and I'm considering them preventable deaths because we can potentially change them by virtue of how we choose to manage dog populations. Obviously, and that's represented, those mechanisms are represented by the yellow circles at the bottom. Obviously, if we choose a management type that requires us to kill adult dogs, that's going to affect the number of preventable deaths. Similarly, if we can reduce the number of dogs and the proportion of them who are reproducing, that should reduce the deaths of all those extra puppies because less extra puppies are being born. And of course, as I mentioned for a moment, changing carrying capacity could change those things too, but we don't necessarily have the capacity to alter that. So with all of that background, the question then becomes, how can dog population management be structured to minimize preventable deaths? I can only touch on this in a short talk, but here we go. The approach we used to ask this question was created for some cat research that a group organized by ACC&D did, and it's the subject of a recent paper, which you see here. And what I've done for this talk is just spend a little bit of time repurposing that analysis for dogs. It's done in a simulation modeling framework, which most of you are familiar with, and that's illustrated in this little loop down at the bottom. It's just trying to mimic how populations work within the confines of a computer universe. And it has various parameters that characterize birth rates, survival rates, death rates, movement. And it incorporates the messiness of the real world, the chance that occurs when we try to measure these things and that we never measure them perfectly. Models of this sort don't give us perfect answers. You have to take the specific numbers they spit out with a grain of salt, but they can be quite good for comparing different scenarios or different alternatives. And what I've done here is just to take the parameters that are illustrated in this box that we researched and created to try to mimic cat populations and alter them a little bit to better mimic dog populations as I currently understand it. That's a preliminary process. It probably needs to be refined if we move forward with this work, but that's what I've done so far. And within that modeling framework, we looked at several different types of management. Doing nothing, taking no action, two different forms of removing dogs from the population and then presumably euthanizing them in shelters, a low intensity, which I call light, and a heavy intensity, which I call heavy. And those are characterized by the percent of dogs in the population that are removed in any particular time step, which in this case is 6-month time step. Done the same thing with culling, which is the same as removal, except that in culling, rather than removing animals every time step, we remove the dogs initially and then let the population build back up more or less to its starting point before we do another cull. And then finally, sterilization. The light sterilization involves sterilizing 25% of the reproductively capable dogs every 6 months, and the heavy sterilization involves sterilizing a higher proportion of them. So when we take those scenarios and put them into the model, we set it up to run for 10 years. We start with a population of 100 dogs. And we define the carrying capacity in this population as 100 dogs. So we're dealing with a population at the carrying capacity. And as that model runs for 10 years, we track the number of puppies who were ever born, the number who live to adulthood, and the number of those puppies who die prematurely in what I'm calling a preventable death way, plus the number of adult dogs that are killed under certain, but not all, management scenarios, which add up to the number of preventable deaths. And these are added up cumulatively over a 10-year period to see where we stand. And if we do that, we get the results I'm about to show here. Now, again, I want to stress that the actual numbers that you see here should be viewed cautiously. Those will change if I were to get better information and change those dog-specific birth rates and survival rates and death rates. But what I don't think will change very much is the comparative height of these bars across the different management scenarios that we see here. So what we have plotted is the total number of puppies who were born under these different management scenarios, broken down into the number that live to adulthood and the number who die prematurely because there's not space for them. And we see some very interesting patterns here. You see that no action, that doing nothing, results in a lot of puppy births and a lot of puppy deaths. And that culling is not much different. For removal and sterilization, we see that we reduce the number of puppies who were born. And we also, if you were to do the math here, tend to decrease the proportion of them who die, and certainly the absolute number of them who die, particularly if we do either of those scenarios at high intensity. And looked at so much if we do it at a lower intensity, by the way. Now, this is looking at not preventable deaths, but the population size as it tracks over time under several different sterilization intensities, which are 25%, 50%, 75%, and 100%. Again, the percent indicates the percentage of animals who are reproductively capable at any given time who are sterilized at 6-month intervals. And we see very different outcomes in terms of final population size based on a progressively higher sterilization intensity, which doesn't surprise anyone. But what may surprise you is that the actual number of surgeries we do over those 10 years is essentially the same, whether we're doing the high intensity or the low intensity. And the reason is that a high intensity doesn't mean that you're doing a whole bunch of surgeries for the whole 10 years. It means that you're doing a high intensity when you start to try and get that large proportion of animals sterilized. And then because most animals aren't having puppies, there are fewer and fewer of them to sterilize in subsequent years. So by front-loading the effort at this 100% scenario into the early years, you don't do any more surgeries over 10 years, but you get a much better population outcome. And as we saw, you get a much better outcome with regard to preventable deaths. So the lessons here in this short talk are that doing nothing is a good way to maximize puppy deaths. Nature is rather cruel in that regard. That culling is not particularly effective for anything, but certainly with regard to this preventable deaths equation. And that when it comes to sterilization, trying to achieve high intensity and high front loading are absolutely critical, both for minimizing the preventable deaths that occur and for reducing population size. And again, the reason is that by doing that front loading, you rapidly start to reduce the number of dogs that are present and rapidly reduce their reproduction rate. And those two things not only have their direct effect, but they have a multiplicative effect. They basically complement each other in that multiplicative way, which is why it's so advantageous to do your sterilization at that high intensity with a lot of fluiding. So with that said, I think I'm about out of time. I just want to acknowledge the major partners and the CAT work that was the basis for this preliminary dog-related analysis that I presented. I may be on Skype if all of that works technologically to answer questions for a few moments. But if not, you're welcome to contact me with further questions. So best of luck for a great meeting, and thank you very much.